Well, first of all, may I say what a privilege it is to be here. And I apologise in advance if my voice sounds a little ropey. I'm coming towards the end of a cold, so I'm just hopeful that my voice will hold up. I bring greetings on behalf of the staff and students of Spurgeons College. And I want to tie in a little update on the college with the theme that I want to speak on today, because I do believe that God has laid on my heart this concept that Christ will build his church. Part of my concern is that I think we have allowed ourselves to become conditioned by a narrative that we have not created, designed to, I think, actually depress us. Now, my academic career is primarily associated with ethics, and so I spent a number of years trying to create ethical concepts. I'm very privileged to have been involved in articulating the ethical foundation for the British Army. And in the process, I was a pioneer of something called experimental philosophy, in which I interacted with social psychology and moral philosophy. And one of the things that I discovered in my studies on this is that the majority of people, for example, everyone in this room, would believe that you have a very good grasp of what's right and wrong. You would have an absolute belief that you would do the right thing when placed in an ethical dilemma, and would have every expectation that you would be the one who would do the right thing. Tragically, however, studies show that human beings are remarkably consistent, and they do not act in the way that they would wish to act. And there's a variety of reasons for that. And if you want to ask me later of some of the experiments that were done, it's depressing how consistent human beings are. I mention that because I'm convinced. You wouldn't mind turning the volume down a little. I come from Northern Ireland, and I like to raise my voice. And if the microphone is too loud, I sound like another Northern Irishman. I literally do. And it just gives me a little bit of more. Can you all hear me okay? Can you hear me at the back? It's not. That's excellent. So if I was to say to you, would you allow the world to press you into its mold? I'm absolutely convinced, like all of those people who would say they would do the right thing at the right time, you would be utterly and completely convinced you would not be a world-shaped Christian. I'm not so sure. I'm really not. Because I think we've bought into a narrative that we're in a bad way as far as the church is concerned. Last year I invited Professor Steve Bruce down to Spurgeons College, and there was a reason for that. Steve is a well-known sociologist. He's actually just retired now. And he happened to be my son's supervisor doing his degree at Aberdeen. And somehow Steve worked out that the Aaron McCormack he was tutoring was the son of the Philip McCormack who had just been appointed as the principal of Spurgeons College. And so in one tutorial, Steve said to Aaron, "I will never be invited to Spurgeons College." One of Steve's big books, one of his famous books, was entitled God is Dead. So it was a kind of, I have to say, I laughed whenever my son told me this. I'm okay. I went and spoke to senior staff in the college, and I said, what about inviting Steve Bruce down to Spurgeons? So I asked him, and he said yes. And he was surprised. And he said to me when he came down, it was only the second time in 40 years of academic work that he had been invited by a church setting to come and speak about his research. And he was slightly surprised, but I said to him, well, why should you be? Spurgeons is an evangelical college. I'll talk about Spurgeons in a moment. But if we want to see the transformation in our society, we need to engage with academics like you. We need to hear what your voice has to say. I don't agree with your interpretation. And the reason why I don't agree with his interpretation that the church is dead in the United Kingdom is because Christ will build his church. I'm utterly and completely convinced of the fact that Christ will build his church. And that you and I are a part of that process because the mission is not complete. And it's that that underpins the work that we're seeking to do with Spurgeons College at the moment. And I want to take an opportunity to speak about that. Because it's not just something that's a principle to hold. It's actually a guiding, directing, motivating idea that animates what me and my senior staff and my team seek to do at the college. And so with that in mind, I want to share some of the developments about the college because it ties in with this concept of Christ building his church. I want to speak about 4 major projects that we're doing at the moment. Theological education in the UK is under extreme pressure. Many colleges are facing huge difficulties. And Spurgeons College is no different from the other large theological colleges in the UK. But what we do have are 6 acres of prime, underdeveloped real estate in London. And so we're towards the back end of what's known in kind of project management terms for the process of developing the back end of phase 2 of a £70 million development project at Spurgeons College that will deliver 3 specific ideas. First, that we will have an external income stream of approximately £500,000 a year that's not related to student fees, to grow our reserves by £3.5 million, and to have a brand new purpose-built suite of university buildings fit for the 21st century. So as you can imagine, that's demanding a tremendous amount of time with my senior staff. But that, believe it or not, although I said 70 million, that's not the big project. The linchkey in this is we took the decision just over a year ago to seek degree awarding powers. Now, for those of you not familiar with higher education, most theological colleges, actually all theological colleges, are validated by a secular university. We are seeking to be the first theological college in the United Kingdom to have the authority to grant its own degrees. We will design the degrees, we will validate the degrees, and we will offer our own degrees. Now, the significance of that is huge. It's enormous. And so one practical illustration of this is that when I became an all-team leader and go to these exciting meetings with Mark and others, I heard that one of the strategic priorities of the Baptist family was pioneer missional leadership. And I heard a lot of talk about this. And so we applied to the Mission Forum for a grant, and we appointed someone about 2 weeks ago to construct and devise and to write a course specifically tailored for pioneers. Written by pioneers, designed by pioneers, for pioneers. To do it in conjunction with the mission department, with sort of ministries team in Didcot, so that those who are involved in pioneer mission but can't do the traditional route can still get accreditation by doing and following this pathway. We can design it, we can write it in partnership with leading pioneers within the Baptist family and beyond. And then as a validated degree pathway, those who want or are eligible can seek student loans. Now, for those of you who are interested in some research or some further study, there's been a significant development that I mentioned this morning, and because you didn't know about it, and I'm going to mention it to others, do you know, for those of you who are interested and eligible, there is now a grant of £10,600 for those interested in doing a master's degree. And you only have to start paying that back if you earn £25,000. And there is also and it's very, very new, it's only been made public a few months. There's also a research grant of £25,000 over 5 years for those interested in doing doctoral research. And again, you don't have to start paying that back until you earn £25,000. In other words, if you're a pastor on normal stipend, the government is giving you free money to do research degrees. So the second big project is the Pioneer, with the degree awarding powers and Pioneer. But perhaps the one that I think will have the most significant impact within the Baptist family and further afield is our partnership with BMS World Mission. So we're at the final stages of a formal partnership with BMS. So I've had some interesting conversations with BMS and last week with the General Director, Kang Sang, and we're opening Spurgeons Midlands at what used to be IMC at Selly Oak. So from this September, Spurgeons College will be running its lay ministry training at IMC. They don't call it IMC anymore, but everybody knows it at IMC. And we will also start full-time and part-time ministerial training at Birmingham in September. Once we achieve degree awarding powers, from September 2020, we will be able to offer the full suite of Spurgeons courses at Birmingham. Last summer, I had a conversation with Mark Ord from BMS, and he was saying that they were actively seeking a partner, a Baptist partner, to partner with them. Because BMS are really interested in partnering with a college to develop and grow missional disciple programs. And so one of their aspirations is to create a mission faculty in Birmingham. Now, the interesting thing about being a degree awarding institute is that we can then validate the staff, validate the programs, and the programs that BMS offer, we will validate. So it's no longer associated with a secular university. We're also investing heavily in a particular type of software that enhances the online provision. So it doesn't matter where a BMS worker is, whether they're from the UK or from the global south, they should be able to access these newly designed and validated programs anywhere in the world. Now, to me, that is a huge step forward. But why do this? Well, the answer is really simple. I am absolutely, utterly and totally committed 100 zillion% to the principle that Christ will build his church, and that he has not finished in that task, and that what God is seeking and desiring are those who will partner with him. But it's interesting when you get into the passage, just checking the time. I don't want to go too long today. If speaking were an Olympic sport, I say this regularly, you've heard me before, you'll have heard me say this, I could be a gold medalist. I just have that Irish gift of the gab, and I just don't want to talk unnecessarily today. I want to be conscious of time. The context of the passage is fascinating when you begin to unpack it. It's not an accident that Matthew records that they were in Caesarea Philippi or in that region. And the significance of it is achingly profound. William Barclay, in his little commentary, seeks to give some background to this, in which he explains that the whole area would have been festooned with the remnants of Baal worship from years before. There is a specific hill, and beside it a deep cavern, and that was often associated with the birthplace of the Greek god Pan. And then Caesarea Philippi itself. The name is a combination. It was first Caesarea, and it's a Caesar's town. And one of the standout features of it was an enormous white marble temple to the deity of Caesar. And then to distinguish it from the Caesarea on the coast, it was named after Philip, one of the sons of Herod. So the context within which the question is asked is significant. This was an area that was festooned with ancient notions of what God was. And then Jesus turns to his disciples and he asks them, "Whom do people say that I am?" And so you get the answer. Some say John the Baptist. And there's no doubt that many thought that John the Baptist would be the forerunner of the Messiah. But he got his head chopped off. Or others, Elijah. Or Jeremiah. Now, some may be surprised at why Jeremiah is mentioned. But Jeremiah is specifically mentioned in the book of Maccabees as a forerunner to the Messiah. As someone who would come just before the Messiah would come. Now, often when I've heard people preach on this, they're extremely critical of the people, thinking that they're only suggesting that Jesus was a notable prophet. But another way of viewing this was saying that Jesus was Elijah or Jeremiah or John the Baptist was probably as much as a Jew could do. It was as much as they could go. But of course, it's not far enough. And then Jesus turns and says, "But whom do you say that I am?" I listened to a sermon online, and I have to say I really enjoyed the bit whenever the preacher said, "You could almost imagine the tumbleweeds flowing through the setting." Oh, no. We weren't really expecting that. Or that's not particularly helpful. And you can almost imagine, because one of the lovely things about Scripture is that it doesn't try to pretend that people were other than they are. I like the fact that the disciples argued, and the Gospels tell us that they argued. I like the fact that the disciples argued about who would be the greatest. So that we don't imagine that these people were different to us, cut out of a different type of clay to us. They're very similar to us. They're very ordinary, just like you and me, shaped by some of the same passions that we're shaped by. And I can almost imagine that when Peter started to speak, they were going, "Huh?" And then he goes, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And I can almost imagine them going, "Well, where did he get that from?" I mean, let's face it. This is a standout, striking statement. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus explains that he didn't make it up of his own volition, but it was the Father in heaven who explained to Peter and revealed to Peter that Jesus was indeed the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then you know the text where Jesus says, "Blessed are you, Simon. The flesh and blood has not revealed this to you." And then the key phrase, "On this rock I will build my church." And I believe the rock on which the church is built is the belief that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now, why is that significant? Well, I've spent the best part of 30 years engaged in all kinds of academic study and research. And I can honestly say that nothing in my academic study or professional preparation prepared me for the nonsense of the age in which we live. It is almost beyond belief. Where white is black, up is down, in is out. What we thought were simple, obvious things are not simple, obvious things. And I'm going to be contentious. Where someone wearing a T-shirt saying woman, noun, adult, female, can be quizzed for a hate crime. There was a sociologist called Zygmunt Bauman, and he came up with a really interesting phrase. And his phrase and his idea was liquid modernity. I won't bore you with all the details of what that involved, but effectively what he argued was that in this postmodern age, concepts have been taken and melted and molded, and they've become fluid, movable, transient. And we live in an age in which even the most obvious is nothing but an opinion. And someone else's opinion is just as good as anyone else's, whether or not they know anything about the subject. Except, of course, when it comes to brain surgery. We will say, no, we do want somebody who knows about the brain to operate. My dad had some surgery done to insert those stents into his heart. I was really glad that the person doing it understood how this process ran. I just didn't want someone to have a thought about it or a feeling about it. But we live in an age that is incredibly fluid and malleable and moving. And we are told as a church that we need to reflect this society. Now, if you're sensing from me that I may be some kind of old-fashioned conservative evangelical, you're absolutely right. I stand in the historic tradition of the Christian church regarding the fundamental doctrines of our faith. And absolutely foundational to what I believe, and what I believe the church should believe, is that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. He's not a religious figure. He's the Son of God. He's not a moral philosopher. He's the Son of God. He's that and more. But you see, even this week there was a story that broke that just made my heart sink. Don't know if you followed it in the news. About an asylum seeker whose asylum was rejected. His application was rejected. Because he said he converted to Christianity as a religion of peace and fled Iran because his life would be intolerable. And some official in bureaucracy said, Christianity is not a religion of peace. And then quoted several verses to justify the incredulous notion that Christianity is not a religion of peace. Now, I think whoever did that was probably having coffee with an interview without coffee, because it embarrassed the government, because the response has been fairly forthright. But we live in an age in which we as a church are being asked to accommodate society outside. So that as it moves and flows and ebbs and moves, so we must flow and ebb and move. Forgetting that the church is built on an immovable rock that remains consistent and never changes. And it is this doctrine that Christ is the Son of God. But I have a confession to make. I think I misunderstood this verse. Now, it'd be interesting to have a discussion with the theologians here about what I'm going to say. My image of this passage, I think, was wrong. And I feel like a numpty saying that. Although, in defense, I rarely preached on this passage in my Christian ministry. I had this image of Hades standing resistant against the advance of the church. That's what I thought. But I think that's the wrong image. I don't think that's the image here. And we can have a discussion afterwards and you can challenge me on it. I don't think that's the image. Some of you will know that I have a military background. I did over 20 years as a chaplain in the Royal Army Chaplains Department. And then, because I'm just so old now, I can go back into the early 80s when I was a soldier in the Ulster Defence Regiment. And so sometimes I do think like a military individual. When you're immersed in the military, you begin to think in military terms. And I know that the gates on a citadel or a city needed to be the strong point, because that would often be the focal point of attack. And you know, down through the years, gate technology became incredibly sophisticated. To the point whereby, if you grew up watching Kirk Douglas films, I think some of you are old enough to remember the film he starred in with Tony Curtis about the Vikings, where they dragged the big giant tree 500,000 miles across land and then charged down the hill, and the battering ram flew into the gate, and then they ran over and axes, and everybody was killed. It's all horrible. That's not the technology that was generally used. Often the approaches to castles or to citadels would have been zigzagged, specifically for the reason of not allowing opportunity for someone to create a big, giant, massive battering ram and then have 200 metres where they can go, yay, and attack the gate. Gates have this image of being the strong point, the point that's vulnerable, and the defence. And in my head, I had often thought that as the church expands, as it grows, as God's kingdom comes to fruition and the purpose of God comes to fulfillment, that eventually even the gates of Hades would crumble. But I think that that's the wrong image. And the reason why I think it's the wrong image is taken from two passages in Ephesians 4 and in Peter, where Peter talks about Christ preaching to the imprisoned spirits. And you have that wonderful passage in Ephesians 4 of where Paul talks about ascending into heaven and leading captivity captive. Now, what a moment that must have been. In Hebrews chapter 2, we read that but now we see Christ crowned with glory and honour. We don't have the time, or I would take you to Psalm 24 now, the Psalm of Ascension. Be you lifted up, you everlasting doors. What for? For the King of glory is coming. Who is this King of glory? The King mighty in battle. How do we imagine Jesus returned to glory? Now, I know I'm using a wee bit of preacher's license here, so I hope that you will forgive me. But it wasn't kind of, hello, back. I actually don't think so. If we take a lead from Psalm 24, which is a progressional psalm, you sing it in parts, and it reflects the Ark of the Covenant being taken up to Jerusalem. And then you get to that point where the people in Jerusalem are ready, the ramparts are manned, and the processional train demand that the gates open because the King of Glory is standing there and demands entrance. I think, forgive me for being poetic here and using preacher's license, but I think there must have been a moment when all of heaven was prepared and ready. And the procession of Christ into glory would have been beyond my ability to describe it. As the King of glory returns to glory victorious, leading captivity captive, with all of heaven arrayed, standing there, amazed at the return of the conquering King, with Hades demolished, vanquished. You see, I think the point of this is not that Hades resists against the church, but that Christ just burst the doors out. Death could not hold the Prince of Life. And so the context is Calvary is not that far away. And when Christ says to them, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it, I cannot help but wonder if he had in mind the crucifixion and his death and the absolute confidence that not even death and the abode of the dead could hold the Prince of Life captive. Because even the gates of Hades would have to yield to the power and life of Christ. Boom. And the Prince of Glory rises from the dead. But the truth is, there's nothing about this that remotely would correspond to how you and I would plan this type of operation. I thoroughly enjoyed, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about the projects that EMBA are doing. But if any institution or group planned things that went as spectacularly badly, at least superficially, as what transpired in the next chunk in the Gospels, and then afterwards, and then in the first 200 or 300 years, there's nothing about what happened that makes sense from a worldly perspective. There's nothing about the crucifixion of Christ, standing looking at it from an earthly perspective, suggests that victory was being won. Nothing. From a worldly perspective, all you see is a battered, bruised, tortured, mutilated individual, ruthlessly put to death, without any compulsion by secular authorities. And what happens to all the leaders? They run away. But then resurrection happens. And these frightened men are transformed. And they do amazing things. But church history tells us that most of them suffered awful deaths. We have this terrible tendency in the Christian church to associate success with faithfulness when nothing could be further from the truth. Success is God's. Faithfulness is what He demands of us. The results are His. But if you were to look at the early church and the persecutions and being scattered and more persecutions, I find it instructive to even reflect upon the letter from Pliny to Trajan. Trajan was a Roman emperor. Pliny, one of his senior bureaucrats. And Pliny was very happy to kill Christians. Didn't bother him in the slightest. Very happy. Very content to continue to kill Christians. Just not entirely sure why we're doing it. I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically the argument. I'm just curious, Emperor Boss, are they guilty of some crime, or is it just a crime to be a Christian? But don't worry, I'll still keep killing them. Interested in the answer. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of persecution. And today, our brothers and sisters are persecuted in countries around the world. Do you know the odd and amazing thing of all this? The church is growing. I'm utterly convinced that the church today is larger than it has ever been at any time in human history. And yet we in the United Kingdom can allow ourselves to believe that at most all we can do is keep the life support machine going, at least until our generation dies. Well, if this is our theology, it is utterly unworthy of this text. Because in an age of fluidity and movement and uncertainty, we have an unmovable foundation, which is our belief that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And this is the one who spoke victory. I will build my church, and not even the gates of hell will overcome it or prevail. So it's not me saying this. It's not Mark or any other leader here. It is the victorious one. Christ's work is not finished in the United Kingdom. That's why my college is investing so much. Our primary vision has not changed. It is to train and equip men and women for mission, ministry and leadership in the contemporary world. Why? To transform our society. To see churches grow. To see people saved. There's an old-fashioned idea. Yeah. To see names written in the Lamb's Book of Life. Because they have had a living encounter with Christ. And here's the challenge. In the providence of God, and this is something that I do not understand, despite all the letters that apparently are after my name, I still do not understand this. I cannot fathom it. I can't work it out. That the master builder chooses to use lumps of clay like you and me. That's all we are. Lumps of clay. And all the master builder potter asks is that we will allow him to shape us to fit his purpose. And if we allow him to shape us to fit his purpose, the most amazing thing happens. In his amazing grace, he permits us to partner with him in the salvation of souls. Isn't that amazing? Could it be that perhaps the reason we have not seen the growth I'm sure we all desire is because we have not been malleable enough in the Master's hands? Or we have been convinced that all we can hope for is keeping the life support machine going. At the start of the year, I had no thought about preaching on this subject. But I believe that God has led this deeply in my heart. And I believe that it is aligned with what we're seeking to do as a college. Because I believe there is a deep, heartfelt desire within our Baptist family to see God move powerfully in salvation. But it does mean believing and recapturing and bringing to our heart biblical concepts like, I will build my church. The kingdom of God will come. The only question, brothers and sisters, is whether or not we will pioneer with God. We will allow ourselves to be equipped by God. We will partner with God, and in caring, loving partnership, see our societies transformed.